Hey everyone, this is going to be a rather unique entry into my book to doc, sometimes also book to pod to doc. You know, we've expanded this feature, but even though we've expanded this feature and been doing other things with it, this is going to be another kind of unique entry. And it is inspired by one of the few things giving me joy lately, which is weird when I say that we're gonna do this and then talk about a murder case, but stick with me for a second. You guys may have noticed I haven't been posting a ton. The depression is depressioning. That's that me depresso. Things have just been a little bit of a struggle. Trying to write my dissertation, teach, live. I've just been kind of needing to focus a little bit on me and just doing things that I can relax with, or just like not use my brain a ton. And again, I recognize that doing that with true crime is a weird choice, but I think one of the things that has always really interested me about this genre is its evolution and how we tell these stories. In some cases, not a lot of evolution, but I think there's been a real reckoning with true crime as it's gotten more and more popular about how we tell these stories, how we think about victims, how we think about perpetrators, all this type of stuff. And so again, this is a lead-in to, I have found a new source of info and a new podcast that's been making me really happy. And something that happened recently with a true crime doc that I was watching fit perfectly into this feature. And so I want to tell you guys about it. Before we get there though, you have to know the entire context of my story with this true crime adventure. So many of you may have heard about the Delphi murders, which is that they're commonly called. There's also about the High Bridge. This story started in 2017 when 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby German were reported missing and then subsequently found murdered. This happened in Delphi, Indiana, and their bodies were found near this really tall walking trail bridge, where they were apparently walking on a day off from school when they were attacked and, like I said, subsequently murdered. This story has continued to capture the nation's attention because it did take quite a while to resolve, in the sense that this has been a very hiccupy kind of search for this person. There was originally a sketch that was released by some potential eyewitnesses. After a while, they also released a different sketch that they claimed was, now they're calling him Bridge Guy for the longest time. Libby, one of the murdered girls, was just one of the smartest people in the world. When she realized that she and Abby were in danger from this person that was following them, she actually took out her phone and recorded a little bit of video of Bridge Guy and also got his voice. Now, it was a very short clip, but Libby, who apparently wanted to potentially go into law enforcement, she didn't get to do that, but she did basically help solve her own murder, and that's incredible. My heart goes out to both of these girls and how strong they stayed in what was a very violent end to their short lives. It wasn't until basically within the last year or so that they actually identified who Bridge Guy was. They indicted him. He went to trial and he is now convicted. This man's name is Richard Allen. But because there was such a period of time when they were hunting for Bridge Guy and trying to solve this case, and then the actual murder trial of Richard Allen became very extended and kind of weird, there's been a lot of writing and different podcasts and stuff following this case. And so after Richard Allen was kind of identified as Bridge Guy, I kind of was like, okay, now I'm not good with unsolved crime. Let me put it this way. But I was like, now that there is starting to be potentially some resolution to this story, I was ready to kind of dive into it and kind of figure out what was going on and learn more about this story that had, like I said, captured national attention. So the first book that I read was called Down the Hill: My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi by Susan Hendricks. This was such an interesting book. Now, I knew when I started it that this book had been published prior to the identification of Bridge Guy. So let me be very clear that when I started it, I was aware that it wouldn't go into the full specifics of the case. But what I found very compelling about this was that Susan Hendricks, she's a reporter who was one of, she claims, like the first on the scene when this started happening. And she became very, very close to the families of the murdered girls. And she had a very strong personal connection with them. And again, when we think about true crime, there is plenty of true crime that really sensationalizes the crime and the person who committed it, when the true victims and their families are sometimes forgotten. And so I really appreciated throughout this book the attention and care and connection that Susan Hendricks had with these families, and being able to really tell this story from a victim-centered perspective. However, that was the only good thing about this book, in the sense that Susan Hendricks is and was a broadcast journalist. And there are huge chunks of this book that are just like verbatim transcripts from interviews or reports that she was giving on the news while this case was being investigated. And I do mean verbatim, not summarized, just like, I assume if they were on the page, they would have just been like, Susan, ba-ba-da-ba-da, person, ba-ba-da-ba-da. And it was huge chunks of the book that were meant to like move the plot along. And now I listened to this as an audiobook, and I was like, if you were going to include these, I mean, you could have at least included the audio, I guess. Like, this was a book that I assume most people would like read physically, that felt like it was never meant to be a book at all, in the sense that maybe it should have been a podcast, a radio play, something, because choosing to include that information like that in the genre of book was just such a weird choice, and it threw me off every single time I encountered that throughout the book, and it was a lot. So even though it is, like I said, very emotionally connected to the victims and their families, it's a really, really weird reading experience that I wouldn't necessarily recommend. Now, I knew that I would be doing more with this case because, like I said, I went into it knowing that this wouldn't give me the full story. But I'm also very curious sometimes about things like, I have a podcast that was following the Gilgo Beach murders, for example, throughout the entire search for the Gilgo Beach serial killer, and like all the different theories that were explored or explained, which sometimes kind of get erased from the narrative once we actually like know who the person is and they zero in on him. But yeah, even for that, I don't know that I would really recommend this book to anyone. So I don't know if it was just like the weird reading experience that I had, or life just happened, but I didn't really do the follow-up after the Susan Hendricks book on this case that I really intended. And I didn't really engage with it at all until flash forward to this year, when Hulu releases a documentary called Capturing Their Killer: The Girls on the High Bridge. This is a 3-episode docu-series that I thought was going to be really interesting to watch, because at this point Richard Allen had not only been, arrested for the murders, but he had been convicted. And so I was really interested at this point to be like, oh, I don't have to read another 300, 400 page book. I could just watch 3 episodes and kind of maybe fill in that gap a little bit that was left after I finished Susan Hendricks' book. The documentary starts off, and again, it is really wonderful to see the families of Libby and Abby. extended family really has just put their heart and soul into this case for so long, and it's just really heartbreaking to hear how long this has gone on and what they've gone through. And the girls were so young as well, and the documentary, you know, reaches out to them. They're involved. The first episode in particular really focuses on Libby and Abby as people, and who they were when they were here. And that was all really well and lovely. But around episode 2, I just started to get a weird feeling. And so the first thing that happens is, in the first episode, there is a woman who is like on the little, you know, tag is identified as a resident of Delphi or whatever, but her last name is Allen. And at that point I'm like, isn't his last name Allen? And then like cut to like when eventually he's, you know, arrested for this, it's then revealed that yes, she is his wife. And you know, I am not at all opposed to having, you know, all of the extended family members of a crime like this involved. Oftentimes it is also the families of the killers who are also betrayed and horrified and guilty and staggered. And, you know, a lot of times we actually maybe don't hear their voices, even though they are dealing with, you know, the fact that someone that they knew and potentially loved committed a horrifying crime, and they're trying to like deal with that as human beings with empathy. But then Richard Allen's defense team ends up really involved in this documentary, and I was like, this is weird. Where is the prosecution? What is this? Why does a huge chunk of this 3-episode docuseries spending time on Odinism and a potential cult killing? What is this? What is going on? And my fiance had come out and he was sitting there watching the documentary with me, and I was just like, I watch a lot of these and this one feels like it has a slant. And my fiance goes, don't they all have a slant? And I was like, fair, but usually it's toward the victim. And I just really felt like something was off. And in the 3rd episode, by the time we got there and we were like, you know, he's going to trial, he's becoming convicted, like that episode ends and I'm just like, how did this guy end up convicted of this murder? Because if all I knew was what this documentary just showed me, I would have a lot of questions about this trial and the justice system. And now I've watched things like The Staircase. There is room for healthy skepticism of the justice system, especially if you are a person of color, or, you know, you don't fit into, like, you're some member of a marginalized group. Like, it's not just healthy skepticism, it is necessary skepticism of the justice system, but it felt weird. And so I knew that I had to do more research, more listening, more watching, and I just didn't really know where to go. There are podcasts like Murder Sheet that have been following this case from the beginning, and I was just like, I just can't catch up on a million episodes of Murder Sheet, right? Like I was like, I need somebody to break this down for me, because I kind of felt like I was going a little nutty. I was like, something's definitely weird here, but I don't know how to put my finger on what. So a few weeks prior to this documentary coming out, I had found a new podcast on Spotify called Murder She Watched. This is run by a woman named Amy Archer, and it turns out, I now realize that Murder She Watched is a fairly new spin-off from Amy's main podcast, which is called Little Miss Recap. And prior to Murder She Watched becoming a thing, Little Miss Recap does a lot of reality TV, and they do different documentaries, but they were also doing intermittently true crime podcasts, true crime documentaries, podcasts on true crime documentaries. We're gonna get there. And I guess they must have been so popular that Amy decided to make a break-off channel that became Murder, She Watched. I'd never heard of Little Miss Recap before. Spotify recommended Murder, She Watched to me. And I became so obsessed with listening to Amy and her various co-hosts watching and critiquing true crime documentaries that I went on like an absolutely psycho like deep dive into the back catalog of Little Miss Recap to also then listen to everything that she had done there. And it was a lot of the podcasts or the documentaries that I've already watched. And as someone who doesn't really have a lot of people in her corner that is this obsessed with true crime, it was super awesome to hear not only their critique of like the stories themselves and the people involved in those stories and like who they think did the crime, but also like critiquing the genre of the true crime documentary, which is so important. It's part of the reason I started this series to begin with, even though I've done some book to doc or, you know, pod to doc, whatever, that have not been true crime. A lot of it has been because I am so interested and invested in the ways that these stories are told across different mediums. Luckily for me, like the day after I watched the Capturing Their Killer documentary, Murder, She Watched released a 2-part episode on this documentary. And I just remember one of the first things that Amy says in that podcast was, "Something was weird here," and I literally out loud was just like, I was right. And my fiance was very confused, and I was like, don't talk to me. I have to listen to both parts of this podcast like right now because Amy's gonna tell me all about it. And they did. One of the amazing things about Murder, She Watched is that they go and they also bring receipts. So like they'll do, if something is weird, they'll do like extra research or bring other things to help contextualize the documentary that they have watched. And Amy and her co-host brought receipts of all of the evidence that had not gone into this documentary about how Richard Allen got convicted. Amy had gone back to watch some murder or listen to some Murder Sheet episodes that I wasn't gonna do and was like talking about this and this and this and this and this doesn't make sense and this wasn't in there and this was, and I was like, oh my God, thank you. Because I've been losing my mind over this and here you are just laying it out, like critiquing every step of the way that this documentary decided to have a slant, which is essentially that yes, it's a terrible tragedy that these girls died, but Richard Allen definitely didn't do it, which genuinely is the feeling that you have if you know nothing and you watch this documentary and do no research afterward. Here's how important I find this type of critique, okay? I have never had a Patreon account at all in my life. In my 30 plus years of existence upon this earth, never had a Patreon. That's not a flex, it's just something that I've never done. And the second I realized that Amy had stuff on Patreon that was like deep dives, going back to talking about like feedback about things like Amy Bradley is missing, for example, and doing more of a deep dive on that, talking to other people, like she talks to Julian Weber about the Delphi case. I now have a Patreon account that solely listens to Murder, She Watched exclusive content. So I wanted to do this video, not as a traditional entry into this feature that I do, but just as like an example of the type of journey that you can take when you encounter these same cases in different media and why it is important to not just take them at face value. And so I'm really, really grateful for Murder, She Watched and Amy for doing this feature. And I hope that we will all continue to look at true crime with critical eyes for the sake of victims, their families, and just the truth. So thank you guys for hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.